Hello there. My name is Steve Postell. I'm in the band The Immediate Family and Our House, and I've had a long career, and I'm very happy to be on Talking Blues today, talking to you about more things than just the blues.
Let's begin many years ago with you going to Carnegie Hall to see Segovia. Tell me about that experience and what that meant to you.
Oh, you're going way back. I was thinking I was 5 years old. uh, the backstory to that is that I was taking a walk in Central Park. I grew up in New York City, and my mother and I used to walk through the park while my dad was being a surgeon at the hospital. We'd go to the park. And there was a guy playing the guitar, sitting on it's called the Great Lawn. It's where people sit and read and play music. And for whatever reason, whether it's in your DNA or past lives, whatever you believe, I just was completely transfixed. I'd never seen a guitar and I just couldn't. I made us stay and talk to the guy. So my interest was so great, and they didn't know that much about it, so they took me to a Segovia concert very shortly after that. And it was I just the guitar first of all because that was my first guitar concert. I think that's why I did study classical as well as other kinds of music. But within a year of the Segovia concert, the I happened to see my parents let me stay up and watch the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. And that's the first time I really was aware of electric guitars, and that was it for me. Now I was pretty much done with trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, even though I was only 6 years old.
So, not too long after you started taking classical music lessons, and if I understand it correctly, it wasn't just classical music because I think he taught you how to sing, or singing was also involved in this, which is somewhat unusual, but obviously very beneficial to you. Tell me about that.
Well, this was probably just chance. It's not that my parents researched they got these different kinds of methods of teaching guitar. They got a recommendation from a mutual friend. Don't remember who it was. And the guy who came to teach me, whose name was Richard Neves, was kind of a gypsy kind of guy. He was a Broadway dancer, a Broadway singer, a flamenco guitar player, a classical guitar player, a folk singer, acted in movies. He was one of those New York, lifelong artist gypsy guys. And from the very first day, which is something that I'll always not only commend him for doing, but I know it really established who I am. We started to learn how to read music. We started to learn how to play classical. We started to sing a song, all in the first day. So to me, that became the template that the guitar was integral in singing, in songs, in reading music, in playing classical music. So that's how it started right off the bat. And I'll be forever grateful that that was my first teacher, because there's a lot of other teachers who might have been very valuable, but for what I've done with my career path, that was the way to start for the kind of person and musician that I am and that I became.
Tell me about the singing voice. Is that something that you felt comfortable with from the very beginning?
It is. Years before I took that lesson, so that was when I was 8 or 9, I think. I always sang. I sang along to records. I used to sing songs to my mom, say, and just she'd like to hear me sing. I just liked singing, and I didn't have that fear of it. I think singing is a interesting. It's very internal. It's very physical. It's emotional, and some people are afraid of it or intimidated by it. I just liked doing it from day one. It seemed like.
You see the Beatles, and obviously it changes your life, but you're taking classical music. At what point do you start? Because I think classical music went for a long time,
It did.
but at what point did you get into other kinds of music? Because I think you also got into folk music initially, and I guess rock bands.
Sure. Well, from the first day, that's the thing. I mean, the first day, the first guitar lesson I ever took, and I have the little book. He used to write by hand. He didn't have printed sheet music. He wrote it out every time. In
Wow.
the first lesson, I learned a little condensed version of a classical piece called Leyenda. I learned how to read that, and I learned three chords. I think it was probably D, A, and G, I think. And I played Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley, and sang that. So, so I still remember it. I have that book somewhere that he hand wrote those things. So I was singing folk songs from day one, from lesson one, and and then continued on from there. And then eventually we would learn a Beatles song or whatever. But that was the first song was a traditional folk song called Tom Dooley, and that was the
Wow.
first thing I learned on the first day. I remember that he told me that the first time, the first lesson I took, which is the first time I'd had a guitar, because he bought it at Manny's Music and brought it over. I still have that guitar. It's a Goya G10, it was called, nylon string guitar, which is hanging on my wall. That I did three lessons in one lesson. So obviously I had somewhat of a propensity for this activity. I was sort of three lessons to one was the ratio of the trajectory I was on as a student.
Would it be correct to say that it came easy to you?
Yes, in certain ways, um, for example, and I've taught, I don't teach that much anymore just because I'm too busy, but I've taught a lot in my life. Most people, almost everybody, especially kids, have a real hard time pressing down the notes with their left and having the strings not buzz. I never had that. From the first day, it made, I think, what I've tried to figure out what that is. I think that when I watched The Guy in the Park and Segovia and the Beatles, I was so intent on watching their every move that I internalized what their hands were doing and the shapes of their hands, because it must have been that, because I never had an issue pressing down a note, for example. And even when we started with bar chords, I just could do the bar chords. So these are things that I've learned teaching can take people a long time to get to. So there was an aspect of it that was easy for me. I think um, that's a natural thing, and there's obviously the real prodigies. It's probably easier for them than it was for me, but it wasn't a struggle. Is the answer? Yeah.
And did you love it? Like, is it what you thought it would be when you saw that guy on the in the park playing, and you said, "I want to do that." When once you started to actually play the instrument, was it what you thought it would be?
Well, it wasn't. I mean, I've always loved it. I loved it. I kind of love it more every day. I'm more grateful that I'm still doing it every day. But I think that another thing happens. I'm not to get too esoteric, but there's a short story called "Life on the Mississippi" by Mark Twain, which always had a profound effect on me because he talked about the gist of the story was that he grew up watching the riverboats come down the Mississippi, and he fantasized about what it would be like to be on one and to be a captain on one, and it was incredibly magical to him. And the gist of the story is that when he ultimately got a job doing it and became a captain, it changes. It's not magical in the same way anymore because you have to deal with the actual technical aspects of it, and that becomes part of it. And I think that's what happened very quickly with me. Like I always loved it, but it wasn't magic anymore. It was the thing that I was doing. If that explains, the question a bit. So
Right.
it always was a love affair, and with me always. Um, but I never questioned it. It was so obvious that this is it for me. This is my calling that I went sort of right from it being something I saw as a mystical experience to the thing that I did and worked on.
Okay, so the thing you did, which was I believe focused around classical guitar, that would be the primary focus. Would that be correct to say that, or is it unfair to say that because you were doing other music?
I don't think I don't think so. I think that I loved classical guitar. Actually went to conservatory for classical guitar, was doing classical concerts. I still love it. I still use it as a almost to keep my hands in shape because there's nothing like that. But um, I think after I saw the Beatles, everything I have ever done musically, I think, has been a fuel for ultimately writing, singing, playing rock and roll, recording rock and roll music. I think that's whether it was classical guitar or learning how to score or learning how to engineer, produce it. It ultimately all feeds into this the great love of my life, which is watching the Beatles and what they were doing. So the classical guitar seemed, as much as I loved it, like a conduit to just keep me um, growing. As a matter of fact, there was a point where realized I was doing a concert, classical concert, with a it was about four artists. It was one of those nights where there's four people playing.
How old would you been?
Probably 21, something like that.
Okay.
And the guy before me panicked and he stopped in the middle of the piece and he stopped again and the third time then he got up, walked off the stage, went and got the sheet music, put it in front of him because he blanked out. And I just remember, and then I did my thing and I got through it, but I just was remember that was the day when I went, this is not for me. It's too tense. It's so like every note, if you buzz one note, everyone notices. If you forget where you are, I said this isn't for me. I need it to be more fluid, more improvisational. I still love it, but I'm not going to be a classical guitar player. I'm not going to do concerts. And that day was that particular concert solidified for me, that this isn't my path.
But the fact that you're still seriously pursuing, maybe that's not the right term, but that you were playing classical music in your 20s tells me that you had dedicated a big chunk of your life to that music.
Very much so. I mean, I studied with some great teachers, Oscar Gilia, and some really wonderful uh, classical guitar teachers, and we'd go to master classes, and yeah, it was a very big part of my life. Now, of course, to be any good at that, you're talking, I think, minimum those days was 4 hours of practice a day. I had friends who were doing 8 hours of practice a day, but since I already was writing songs and doing other things, I just didn't have 8 hours to do it. Um, but like my teacher, Elliot Fisk, who's still one of the top classical guitar players in the world, I'm sure he played. He probably still does, but it took. So yes, it was a big focus for me, and I really loved it, and it was part of my identity at the time. And once I gave myself the permission to know I can't do everything. I mean, one of the things, I've always been a very artistic person and I loved all the arts. And at one point in uh, my young hubris, I think it's called, is the word, I thought, well, I'm going to be a classical guitarist, a songwriter, a photographer, a painter, you know, and a writer, and I'm going to write books. I was like, I'm going to do all these things. And right around, 20, I was like, It's not going to happen." There's there's just not literally not enough hours in the day, and I didn't want to be half-assed at at 10 things. So I had to say, you know what? I know what my real love is. My heroes are John Lennon and Paul McCartney and Jimi Hendrix, and these are the people. That's where my real gut, heartfelt love and journey is, and let everything else feed that fire.
Okay, so when I talk to a lot of classical musicians, it's a different kind of discipline in a way that it's more technical. It's about the execution. It's about reading and playing that as perfectly as possible with emotion. In a lot of cases, a lot of those people do not improvise, or that's a different discipline. In your case, the ability to improvise, did that come to you easily?
It's such an interesting question. I had a friend, Ed Manis. Her name is Kim Bova, and her brother was Jeff Bova. And their father was, I believe, a trumpet player in the on the Johnny Carson show. So it was a very musical family. She was a classical pianist, and her brother, who's a very, very prominent arranger and session musician in LA now, was more of a jazz player. And she could not improvise one note. It terrified her. If that music wasn't, and she was a beautiful musician, if that music wasn't in front of her, wasn't happening. And her brother was a wasn't still is a brilliant improviser. It's just such an interesting dichotomy to me to see, both from a musical family. But as soon as I started to write songs, that's an improvisation on some level. And then as soon as I started to play along with, and eventually I got an electric guitar and I wanted to do that stuff, and I started to play along with, I think the first records I played along with were B.B. King, Allman Brothers, and Hendrix. And that's where I sort of learned, okay, you back then you had the record player, you put the needle down, you listen to, you know, 4 seconds, you play it over and over and over again. Um, Particularly I think there was a particular, the, this is just a story that's, and again, these are long stories, some of them, but I'll try to make it short. So I had a friend in high school who had scoliosis, which is a curvature of the spine. And back then, which is maybe 73, there was one real treatment for that, which they put you in a body cast that straightened out your spine for like 8 months,
Well,
full body cast. And so his parents, who were very nice people, and they set him up in his room because he couldn't go to school, and he was homeschooled, and they bought him this beautiful, at the time it was called quadraphonic sound. It never caught on, but it was 4 speakers, and it was a great sound system. And he loved guitar playing. He would have me come over, we'd hang out, and there was an input on the quadraphonic sound system, and I would plug my Jazz Master, my 19, what must have been 69, 70 Jazz Master, and then I would play along, particularly to his favorite record, which was Eat a Peach by the Allman Brothers. So I think the Allman Brothers, that record and that experience of playing and having someone there who seemed to love what I was doing, and it was making him happy and not in so much misery of lying there. I have to say that Dickie Betts and Dwayne Allman were a big start to my being able to sort of freely, because I wasn't imitating their lines. Each wanted me to improvise around what they were doing. But but that's when I went, oh, you can really, this is really fun. You can solo, and then BB King, of course, also as well. Same thing.
I presume the songwriting comes from your love of the Beatles, but how did that start?
Well, let's see. I Yes, I love the Beatles. They're first and foremost on my mountaintop. But there were many others who came along, and but the first, this story I tell a lot is kind of a funny story. The first song I wrote, which I still remember, I don't remember the words. It was called Mr. Sandman, and I was 13, and I wrote the song, and I was so excited, and I went to school, and I had a couple friends. I said, I'm going to play you a song I wrote, and I played it. And one of my friends who was very into music kind of scrunched up his face and said, "Isn't that Mr. Tambourine Man?" So I had, subconsciously, I mean, note for note, stolen the melody of Mr. Tambourine Man and written words to it called Mr. Sandman. And I was forever had a lot of compassion for, like, when George Harrison got sued for stealing that song, and he said, I I hear it, but I certainly didn't do it on purpose, and I believed him because I'd had that my first song I didn't actually write. Um, and then from then I actually did start writing songs, but it's just something I wanted to do. I also always loved reading. I loved poetry. I loved literature, and the idea of putting words to music was thrilling to me. And then of course along came the real poets like Leonard Cohen and Joni Mitchell and Bob Dylan and even Lou Reed and Tom Waits and so on and so forth. So I said, wow, this is great. I can combine this love of a narrative and storytelling with music, and then I got real into uh, that genre of music and John Prine and everyone who were storytellers. That also became something. As much as I loved the popular, Motown and stuff that was more not storytelling as much. It was like cool words with my girl, talking about my girl. It's great. It's classic. But so I loved both. But I, as a writer myself, gravitated towards the sort of poetic side of it.
Okay, so you play classical music and decide, well, okay, maybe this isn't what I want to do. Um, Sometime around that time in your life, you get your first professional gig, which is to go on tour with Man of La Mancha,
Correct.
which is pretty impressive. And I don't know if that's something you pursued. I think it fell on your lap, but is that the direction you wanted to pursue, or no?
Never even crossed my mind. uh, and that's a kind of funny story because in general in our lives, um, things show up that that you didn't plan for, and so I'd seen. I mean, I liked Broadway shows. My parents took me to a lot of shows growing up in New York City, but it literally never crossed my mind. But what happened was, so I was at Mannes College of Music, which at the time, interestingly enough, Juilliard, which was the big music school, didn't believe that classical guitar was a real instrument, so they wouldn't teach it. Now, of course, it's a big department, but at the time, so I was at Madison, they only taught classical music. You couldn't learn it. You couldn't even learn the name of a chord, you know. And I wanted that, so I had to go outside of the school to get it. So I found a guy named Myron Weiss who, um, but who taught sort of in the Ted Green method. For anybody who knows who Ted Green was, a brilliant teacher it's theory and it's sort of jazz, but it's chordal understanding and it's that whole side of playing the guitar. It's not technical so much, but that's what I wanted. I needed to know like what's going on here. What are these chords? How do they work? What am I listening to? So, but I could already play. I was already playing classical concerts, so my hands, I could play the guitar. So I was immediately one of his better students playing wise. And this was probably like mid 70s. And so we had, not only did we not have, we didn't even have answer machines. Like if the phone rang and you had to answer the phone. So, I'd be in his little studio, which was on McDougal Street in Greenwich Village. And if the phone rang, he picked it up. Then you would wait and then you'd go back to your lesson. So the phone rang and I'm practicing in the corner and he's talking and I'm not really paying much attention to the conversation. And then he looked up from the phone. He looked at me and he said, "Hey, Steve, I heard him saying no to something. I heard him like essentially he was turning something down." He said, "You want to go on tour with Man of La Mancha?" And I just went, I guess so. Whatever that is, I guess I do. Because he had played it on at Lincoln Center. They had and there were and none of the guitar players, or three, and I think in that version of the show, that wanted to go. He had a really big career teaching, and he was also doing a new maybe chorus line or something. So I just went, yeah, I guess so. So the next thing I knew, I was for the time getting offered a ton of money, and I'm this kid, really, I'm 19 years old or whatever, and I'm out touring in the national around the country in this national tour. And the guitar in Man of La Mancha is particularly important because not only is the whole show written around sort of a pseudo flamenco guitar part, but the guitarist gets up out of the pit a number of times and joins them on stage. So I was in costume, getting on stage and playing with them, and beautiful experience. And either the first or second, I did a number of tours with it because once you could do that show in that role where you could be on stage and the sing, also was a little singing, you kept getting offered it. The, Either the first tour or the second tour, the lead was John Raitt, who was Bonnie Raitt's father, who was a fantastic Broadway crooner singer. So it was a great experience, yeah. But it did lead me down a different path than I'd ever expected, which was the path of I wouldn't not corporate music, but commercials and Broadway shows and film scoring, TV scoring, and all that side of the music industry, which I hadn't even thought about. But that's who I started to meet being in that world.
What was your confidence level like? I mean, to never have done that before and to all of a sudden be on the road with a major production, what did that do for you?
No one's ever asked me that, and it's interesting. I wasn't nervous, interestingly enough. I think I had that young man's cockiness a little bit, not arrogance so much, but I knew I could do it. And what I was nervous about was what is stage left and what's stage right, and where am I supposed to go when I'm on stage? That was nerve-wracking. But I don't remember being particularly nervous about it. It felt, I mean, a lot of my early work just felt like that's okay, now I'm doing this. It just kind of fell into this is what I do now. I'm not saying I don't, I still get nervous, in certain times. And I've had certain instances in my life where I was like really nervous, like panicked level nervous, like when I first time I did this Tonight Show and things like that. But doing that job, I mean, you had a lot of rehearsal, and yeah, by the time we hit the road, I was pretty confident about what it was I was doing.
And how much live experience did you have at that point? Other than the classical concerts you might have put on, I don't know how much playing you were doing with a rock band, and I get the feeling you really weren't.
No, I didn't play in a rock band until I put one together. Well, around the time I started, yeah, I did start one around then, but I didn't do the high school thing. In high school, if I did play, it was either a classical thing or like a solo, um, coffee shop kind of deals, or maybe with one person. So I hadn't done a lot at all. I'd played a few times, and well, I would play once in a while, and I'd started to book some shows for myself, but I wasn't a weekend warrior at that point. I became that, but I was not. So my path was a little different because a lot of musicians I know were in their high school band and were playing the dances every weekend, and I was not.
When you went to school, did you know what you hoped to get out of it and what you hoped to achieve from it?
I had a vision of it for sure, absolutely.
And what would that have been?
Well, I'll put it in the words of my first manager who signed me. Um, it was all excited, and he took me to this big event at the Bottom Line, and we sat at the big table with Ahmet Erdogan and all these people, head of Atlantic Records, and he had put his arm around me. He said, "Ahmet, this is the next Jackson Brown," and and that's what at the time what I thought. I thought, okay, I'm following the footsteps of James Taylor and Jackson Brown and those guys. That's kind of what it felt like to me. Um, my career took many, many turns so that direct path to like those guys had, to doing it, finding the manager, you get a record deal, and you become that guy. It didn't. That's not how it went down for me. But that's what was in my mind for sure. Whether it was and having a band like they had, like it wasn't me alone on a stage. It was me with that's one of the things that was so amazing. I know we'll probably get to it later, but about me ultimately ending up in the band Immediate Family is that when I would see those guys and I saw them play both with James Taylor and Jackson Brown, my fantasy was I had both. Well, I don't care if I'm the guy singing and they're playing behind me, or if I'm in their band and playing behind James or Jackson. That's what I want. This is what I want. So to 40 years later to actually be in a band with those guys after seeing them when I was 15, 16 was a sort of remarkable uh, moment and chapter in my career.
I have to ask: is that what you wanted because of the caliber of musicians that they were, or was it just the idea of being in a band? Do you know, when you talk about Russ Kunkel or you talk about Leland Sklar, like we're talking top of the line musicians. Is that what attracted you, or was it just the fact of being in a band with a great
Well,
singer songwriter?
it was. I remember when I went to see a James Taylor concert, and James was a huge personal influence on me. Like probably in a way, the Beatles first. I'd have to say in a way, James Taylor second. And so I went with no thought about the backing band at all to see James in New York City, maybe Town Hall, maybe Carnegie Hall, I can't remember. And I had really good seats. I bought them early, and Danny Korchmar and Russ Kunkel and Leland Sklar, and I think Don Grolnick was on keys, or whoever it was, were in this band, and I just couldn't stop listening to them. Like that, what they were playing was so magnificent, and I'd never really paid that much attention to what the guys behind these guys play specifically. I just sort of would listen to the top line, they call it, the melody and the guitar and the words, and it was supportive. I just loved it so much, and I want to be able to do that, and also I want to hear that behind my music when I'm singing and playing.
I mean, they're the best, right?
Yes.
They're the best of the best. And then now that you play with them, do you get that same feeling?
Oh yeah. Oh, it's. I always. I don't get. I have learned as I've gotten older and older to not take anything for granted. And anytime I just played a record release show 2 weeks ago, and Leland was on bass and Dean Parks was on guitar, and I do not take it for granted because those are the guys that I looked up to in every way. So it's a very lot of gratitude to be able to be in their company, making music with them, and it's never. Uh, I remember reading this article where Tom Petty was talking about when I guess when they made up the Traveling Wilburys, and Dylan was his guy. We all probably have a guy.
Right.
There he was hanging out with him, being in a band with him, and I can't remember the specific description, but I went, well, I hope that happens to me sometime because that sounds amazing. Like you kind of have arrived and you're sitting at the table with your one of your idols, and those guys were that for me for sure.
You also spent a lot of time in the studio doing session work, doing commercials and jingles. What did that phase of your career teach you?
Well, ultimately, that I didn't want to do jingles, but it was very demanding. It asked a lot of you, and all this stuff has just taught me so much. Each one of these things, and I mean, doing the jingles were I wrote a lot of them more than there were the guys who were the first called to go play on them. I had a little production company early on that where we wrote a bunch of jingles and played on them. And sometimes I went in as a session singer or player as well. Um, it sets your brain waves up to having to deliver the goods, to being able to hear your ears. It develops your ears because especially in other music that's when you're making your own music and you're in a band, you're kind of already formed what you're being a personality in your own music. When you're going into a session, you don't know what it is. It's a TV show or it's a movie score, or it's a jingle. You're a chameleon. Like you actually would sometimes the producer would ask you specifically, can you? The funny thing is, can you sound more like Danny Korchmar? I would get that, or can you play what Waddy Wachtel would play? And of course, playing with them later was funny to remember that. But so it gave me a lot of a certain skill set of being that kind of musician, where we're exploring different styles and as much as I could, and being able to fit into whatever puzzle, be a puzzle piece in whatever that particular puzzle was supposed to be that day. And that's a great education, and has for me it served me well, particularly as a producer.
I wonder when you have that opportunity to work with a lot of different people to and be asked to sound like a lot of other people, is it difficult to find your own sound?
Well, I think for all of us who are that kind of musician who did came up after that era. In that era, you were expected to have your own sound, and then you were asked over and over again to come play because people knew your sound. Like, we should get Waddy Wachtel on this record. He's the perfect guy, that kind of thing.
Right.
Um, so the answer is that I had certain moments later on, sort of revelatory moments where where I went, oh, this is, well, basically, if up until a certain point as a musician, most of us are comparing ourselves all the time to other people. Like for me, it was guys like Robin Ford and these great players. Like, oh, he knows so much more than me, and he plays. He plays so amazingly, and I'm not that, and uh, and there has to come a moment where you go, well, yeah, but he's not me either. So if I express myself the way I play, that's how I play. It's not the way he plays. No, I can't play like he can. I can play like I can, and he can't really sound like me either. So, um, as a couple. I remember, as a matter of fact, my partner in this Art House CSNY band, beautiful guitar player named Jeff Pivar, he played with Ray Charles, he played with Joe Cocker, he played with Ricky Lee Jones, of course, with CSN, and so on, all these years. I remember, I've known him for over 40 years. He went to see Jeff Beck way long ago. The opening act was Stevie Ray Vaughan. He was so blown away by Stevie Ray Vaughan that he left. He didn't want to see Jeff Beck. And what he was blown away by, he told me the story at the time, that he instantly understood what it meant to be completely immersed in your guitar and what you were saying on the guitar. And then Jeff really blossomed as himself as a guitar player. And that's kind of what you have to find is what's my voice, you know. And when you do all those other sessions and the kinds of things that I was doing, it can take a little longer to go, oh, this is me. Now, I always had that with acoustic guitar playing. That's been, I've always, I guess because of the classical and because I learned all this Leo Kottke stuff, and I always felt that I had a voice with acoustic guitar. But with electric guitar, it took a while. As a matter of fact, speaking of interesting enough, and this winds us all around to some things that are happening now. So I always would have a second guitar player in my bands, what I would call a lead guitar player. And I'd play a couple solos, but at the time I was still writing them out like George Harrison used to do. I'd write out my solo so I knew what I was going to play. So I had a gig booked at the bitter end of my own music, and Jeff Pivar was the lead guitar player on that show. And 2 weeks before the show, and those were pretty big shows at the time because You did a lot of promo and you put posters up and invited everyone, and I used to fill the place. 2 weeks before, he said, "I have some good news and some bad news." Oh, all right, what's the bad news? Bad news is I can't do your gig. And I'm like heartbroken. Oh my God, it's 2 weeks before. What's the good news? Because the good news is I just got a tour with David Crosby and Graham Nash. So I'm going on tour with them. I said, oh, well, okay, obviously you got to take that. I mean, I understand. I said, all right, well, can you help me find somebody who can learn? He goes, you know what? No, you should be the guitar player for this show. Don't hire another guy. You can be the guy. And I did it. I said, okay, I'll play the solos and I'll be and I keyboard player and some other musicians. And and that's when I started to go, okay, I'm gonna find my own voice here. And so I owe Jeff like sort of kicking me in the butt to just go play. You can play, go play, you know.
But how long did it take you to feel like you found your own voice? I mean, I presume that you must have felt a lot of pressure
I
when
did.
all said,
Oh, I did for sure. Um, it was well, as long as I guess we're doing long form here. So so everything I had done, even if it was my own original band or my or whatever, or it was a movie score or a jingle, was very uh, organized and had boundaries in terms of time, or it had to be sort of these efficient. You're doing this one show, you're going to rehearse this one show, um, and even my so since I never had a cover band or something like that. I never did the Beatles thing, which was to go to Germany and play 7 hours a night, for a year. I didn't do that. So everything I did was sort of somewhat high pressure, um, get it right, and play what you knew, and so on. And I was playing out, but it was like that every time. It was a show, and it was almost the same, like we were as if we were rehearsing for a Broadway show, even though it was my own music. I went to the Lone Star Cafe to see Lonnie Mack. Lonnie Mack was a hero of Stevie Ray Vaughan. I had met him when I did a short stint with a band called Pure Prairie Leaf. So I was familiar with him, and Lonnie was, for some reason, I don't know why he's not more well known, but he was talk about blues, he was the real deal. He was one
mm-hmm,
of our great bluesmen and great blues songwriters. And he was like a grizzled, bearded, big guy with a cowboy hat, and everyone in his band with these amazing players like that. And I went to see them at the Lone Star, and they all had their bottle of whiskey on the piano and on the next to the guitar, and they're drinking like fish, and but they were playing. It was so great. Like it had so much emotion, and it was so organic, and they were so together. And I just went, you know what? If I don't start somehow, I got to find a way. I'll never be this, being in the studio all day and playing a show every 3 weeks or once a month. I'm never going to be this, and this is what I want. I want to be that one of those guys who gets on the stage and just lets it rip. And the only way I could think to do it was to do at 30 what I hadn't done all those years, which was put together a cover band, which I did. A great one. It was a really great band. The first one was called Chain of Fools. The next one was called Little Blue, which turned into many other things. And we were really good because of course, knew all the great musicians, and I knew people wanted to do it. We learned 40, 50 songs, and then we got some gigs where we played every single weekend, like a lot of people did when they were in high school. And that's when I found my voice. When it was 500 drunk people in a bar, and we were playing Sweet Home Alabama or whatever, and we were just ripping it, and people were dancing and singing along, and doing that night after night after night, just like, again, I go back to just like the Beatles in Hamburg, who did that. That's to me when they got good, and that, well, they say it as well, and that's when I feel I went from being a practiced good musician to being the real a really integrated musician was doing those gigs.
Do you think your background in classical music, the formative years, might have influenced that path before you decided to improv and do cover band stuff? Like that discipline that you had and just doing one-off gigs and practicing very little, whatever. Would that come from that classical background?
Well, it came from the whole world that I just found myself in after I took
Right.
that first show, is that I was doing that kind of work, and it wasn't an intentional decision to go down that route. It was just that's what I did, and I probably some of the tools I used to learn classical music, and so it was a lot of learn the thing and then play it and practice it and then go perform it in whatever sense. So having the cover bands finally was the first time I'd have this kind of abandon and this freedom to be looser and less uh, regimented in how I was approaching the music. Here's a funny story about that. So we had this gig every weekend in Montauk, which is in the Hamptons, New York, and we played a place called the Tipperary Inn, which is the very end, the tip of Montauk, and it was and we were a great cover band. We were really a great cover band, and
So is this Little Blue?
before it's what became Little Blue. It was called Chain of Fools. It was we had three of us that were the main guys, and we would rotate drummers. We had these wonderful drummers like Bobby Chenard, who came out of Billy Squire's band, and all these great people. Steve Holly from Wings did it a lot, and we had a fantastic set list. It was just we picked our favorite songs to play, and so we had a big crowd. Like you couldn't get in that club. We played Friday, Saturday, and Sunday all summer long, all every weekend, and it was packed. Well, one Sunday we were hanging out. We played the Saturday night, and this is when you played till 4 in the morning. It was started at 10:30 and played till 4. And people started coming up to me and said, "What are you gonna play all Grateful Dead tonight? It's Jerry Garcia died." And people kept asking me it all day when they'd see me in town. Well, for whatever reason, was not a big Grateful Dead fan. I know the reasons, but that doesn't matter. I have a lot of respect for them now, but um, it wasn't my thing, and I didn't know one Grateful Dead song. So, but everywhere I went at breakfast, at lunch, people, are you gonna, what are you gonna do? Are you gonna play all Grateful Dead, or which songs are you gonna play? So actually, it's funny because Jeff Pevar, who's now touring with me, was on that gig as a guest guitar player. And I said, Jeff, what are we gonna do, man? And we all got together, and Steve Holly was on drums, the drummer from Wings, and I think Jeff suggested it. I'll give him credit for it. He said, well, why don't we tell them that it would be disrespectful to play their music, so we're gonna play in their style. And why don't we all smoke a lot of pot, get high, and just improvise all night long on the songs and jam and make every song 12 minutes long. So we said, we're going to honor Jerry not by doing a sort of half-assed version of his music, but by playing with the spirit they played in. And we had a blast. And we improvised. We did our set, but we did it. We stretched out the songs, and we came up with new moments, which is what they did, and it was the birth of the jam band. That's what it means. So that's another night that actually was really defining in terms of how I play and how I express myself. Is that night was so freeing. We didn't even have song forms. We could play the song however we wanted and listen to each other, and so that all that education for me that a lot of people had early, particularly like in their high school band, I got later.
Okay, the other thing you've done a lot of is production work. being a producer and worked with a lot of different musicians. How did that come about, and what makes you good as a producer?
Well, it came about really because um, in the when I started, so we're talking 81, 1880, and I'm doing uh, jingles, that sessions like that, TV sessions and so on. And at the time, two things were happening. One is the only way to record was to go into a recording studio. So the budgets reflected that. The budgets assumed that well they're going to have to pay a lot of money in recording studios, so the budgets were pretty big for doing any of this work.
Mhm.
And then cable TV took off. When cable TV started, it was there was no union. The union didn't protect it. It was the Wild West. So there were no royalty checks or anything. So they would pay you pretty well to do these different cable things. And there was and because it wasn't regular television, commercials didn't have to be 30 seconds or 60 seconds. Some of them were 2 minutes. Some of them were 5 minutes. They called them infomercials. So
Right.
they had to hire guys like me to write the stuff who were willing to not do the union, not go through the union and just. But the budgets were big. Like I'd get some perfume company and they'd want a 5 minute what they called infomercial, but you get $10,000 because they figured you had to go to the studio and you had to hire musicians. And so me and I had a partner. We had a little production company and or jingle writing company, whatever. And we started writing these things together. And we said, we're getting so much money for these things. Why don't we just go buy a bunch of equipment and not spend half of it or 60% of it on the studio? So we started every time we get one of these gigs, we take half the money and we go down to Manny's or somewhere else. We started with an 8-track tape recorder, which turned into 16 tracks there, and a reverb unit and a synthesizer and so on and so forth. So we just started to amass equipment that became ultimately a recording studio, and and it became clear to me that recording myself meant I was not dependent on a studio, an engineer, and a budget. I could, so I just organically started learning how to do it. Um, Initially, probably out of curiosity, but also as a financial exercise in taking more of the budget. And I became really engrossed in the process and fascinated by it. I still am. I mean, I'm always in here in the studio downloading new software and trying new plugins and talking with my other producer friends about techniques they use, like how'd you get the bass sound in that? What would you do? And and uh, and it's a great time right now for that. Because even AI has gotten there's the negative part of it, but it's gotten into the world uh, of recreating the sound of a tape machine, the sound of a great old uh, preamp or reverb unit, and they're getting really good at it. And so it was a combination of expediency, and it was great to be able to make music whenever I wanted to. It was great on the budget because I wasn't spending any money, and then since I was early on with drum machines and the Linn drum and the OBX drum and synthesizers, we stopped using tons of musicians because that's what the sound everyone wanted anyway. So we was well, we don't have to hire a drummer or a string section or a horn section. We'll just use these synthesizers, and I'll play bass and guitar, and you know. So it was a natural progression where it became another instrument. I look at the studio for me as an instrument. So I play the guitar, play the piano, I sing, I play the studio, and and I love that instrument.
How do you prioritize what you do? Because you produce, you're in the immediate family, you have a solo career, you're touring with Our House with Jeff Pivar.
Yep.
Um, How do you manage all that? How does that come together?
Well, one trick is don't be married, don't have any kids, don't have any pets, and don't have plants. So I don't have a lot of demands on my time. I can put a lot of time into what I do. I'm not. It's kind of joking, but it's true. I kind of surround myself with my work to a great degree. Um, at any given time, something will be the priority of the moment. So, for example, the last month has been about two things, pretty much, primarily. One is getting ready for the Our House tour, which has taken a lot of work, and two is promoting my new record, which has taken a lot of work. So sometimes things rise up and they become the the, the priorities. For example, when I score a film, which I haven't done now for 6 years or so. The last one was called Dying to Know, which is a documentary about Timothy Leary and Ram Dass. For 2 months, that's really what I'm doing every day, mostly. I'll do some other things, but so things just naturally um, sort of become your focus if they're pending, you know, on there's a deadline or there's a show or there's a film score that has a date when it has to be handed in or something like that. So I just let it tell me what I have to do. What's next, what's happening right now, and just do it. I like all of it. I enjoy all of it. I mean, right now, if I added it up, I mean, I'm sort of on a little bit of a break from some of them because of the tour, but I'm probably producing between EPs and records, five different EPs and records, and uh, and when I get back off this tour, they'll become priority a little bit, and so
Do you try to prioritize your solo career, or you just don't look at it that way?
on. Well, right now, more so because right now things are really happening, and there's a marketing person, there's a publicist setting up like this interview, and I assume that he set that up, and there's we're creating this digital content, and and I'm talking to actually a digital marketer because I I'm not like the best at like selling myself on social media, so we're probably gonna bring someone in. So so yeah, right now with new record out, I've got a lot of focus on my solo work, but I also feel, and I didn't always feel this way, but everything that I do that isn't like sweeping up the leaves, raking up the leaves outside, uh, it all is the same. So if I'm learning a new piece of software to trigger snare drum sounds, or I'm practicing the guitar, or playing a Bach piece, or singing a song, I, 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 at some point decided it's all the same. It's music. And any of the things I'm doing are preparing me for future music and keeping my music chops alive and or well oiled, the machine. So yes, at this point right now with a new record out, I'm putting a lot of focus on the new record for sure.
New record is called Walking Through These Booths. How do you find time to write when you have so many other things to be working on? Like, is that something that's ongoing and you're just inspired while you're driving down the highway and you think, oh, I need to record that or record that thought and get back to it? And then you're going on tour with Our House and doing music of Crosby, Stills and Nash and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and like I just find it interesting because you seem to be somebody who's always busy on many, many things.
I am. I like being always busy because I guess part of it, I was talking to Leland about this, is we always feel like our next job could be our last, So I'm more comfortable when I'm busy and I'm still working, I'm still doing music, I'm still getting a paycheck for doing this thing I love. Um, but in terms of writing, it doesn't take me long necessarily to write. I just have to have the environment. So, for example, I am not a good writer on the road. I'm sure I've written a song on the road, but not a lot. Like, Jackson Brown used to, the whole Running on Empty record, he wrote a lot of that on the road. Um, I'm too, like, resting my voice, taking a walk in the day to clear my head. So I won't even really, unless something really inspires me in the moment, it's not a the headspace is not there for that. So I go through periods like this tour coming up where I don't even expect to write anything. And then it's something that I have to make room for it, that's true, but it also has to just come to me. Like I have at this point I have to decide a little bit. Sometimes there's an inspiration or you have a dream and you dream a melody, but I kind of have to decide, okay, you know what, it's a quiet day. I don't have any clients coming over to record in the studio. I'm not mixing anything. I'm going to write today. So it's because I have enough. Doesn't mean it's going to be always good, but I have the tools to. I can say I'm going to write now, and I can write. I mean, it's rare that I'd have such a block that nothing would come out.
Wow.
Might, I might not love it, but I can do it. I always admired like that Stephen King. He's like, I write every day from 10 to 1, 3 hours a day. And if it's good, great. If it's not, that's fine. So I can write if I sit down to write. Uh, and but so I have to kind of decide today's a good day to sit down and write something. And right now, the music that's in my head, aside from the CSNY music and immediate family music, is the record that I just did. So I'm not feeling like this tremendous uh, urge or calling to go write a new song. I'm trying to promote these songs, get them under my belt, perform them, and represent them.
Do you have a favorite thing that you do? With all that you do, is there something that you favor more than anything else?
Yeah, yeah. It's what I did 2 weeks ago. I had this amazing band. We played all my songs to a wonderful two sold out shows. There's nothing like that to me. That
So it's a live experience.
the live experience playing my music with great players to I don't care how big or small the crowd is ultimately the best part of this for me by far. I love that. I love being on stage. I love that interplay between an audience and I come from a tradition where the guys I loved talked, told stories, interacted with the audience. I'm not like a Dylan who just stands there and plays quietly. I like to Jeff and I, in this new Our House thing, since both of us have these long histories with Crosby and in his case Crosby, Stills and Nash, we have a lot of stories that are fun. So we intersperse the show with them. They're not rehearsed, but I think audiences are really enjoying that. That it's not, you know, to go see a tribute band, that's great, but just a tribute, they have no connection to the music we do. And so I like the interaction. I like talking to the audience. I like playing music for people. I love recording and writing and being in the studio, but if there's one thing, I can only do one thing, even though it's exhausting. Like right now, I'm tired from last night. Uh, I'm gonna want to go play.
I do want to talk a little bit about the immediate family and how you got into it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Um, let's see. Okay. It started, I would say, I was making a record. I got a record deal with a now defunct label called Emergent Records, and I was in the middle of making. Actually, I had made the record already, um, and through different and Leland Sklar was already on that record, and when we were looking for someone to mix it, and it was a real record deal, so I had a budget to have someone to try different mixers, and because there were so many prominent session players on the record, and the way it sounded, it was a nice, really good sounding record. Everybody we reached out to was interested in mixing it, so we had tremendous opportunity to pick and choose and select someone we felt was the most appropriate for to mix the record. Anyway, long story short, I heard this beautiful record that Graham Nash and David Crosby had done, and the mix was I thought was would be perfect for me. And the guy I looked on the record, and it was Nathaniel Kunkel, who was Russ Kunkel's son. So Russ was mixing my record, and he said, I won't be available for 3 or 4 days because we're doing this reunion at the Troubadour with Carole King and James Taylor and the original band, which was Leland Sklar, Russ Kunkel, Danny Kortchmar, James Taylor, and Carole King. That was the original band that played the Troubadour 50 years prior. And then he said, you should, come to the show, which of course was thrilling. Like, I'll be there. So I went to see it turned into a tour ultimately, which I also was involved in doing some engineering after the fact. And so I knew Leland pretty well. We'd played together a bunch. Never met Carol. Never met James. I knew Russ a little bit because Nathaniel was his son, and I'd done a video with me, Russ, and Leland for this teaching app where we talked about rhythm section or whatever. And I met Danny, who was really for me, he was a guy who wrote and produced and played guitar with Jackson Browne and James Taylor and Carole King and Linda Ross. He was a big figure to me, and we really hit it off. Like, and he said, I'm coming back. Let's get together. So when he came back to L.A., we started to write together and play together a little bit, and then I invited him to come in and sit in at these fun jams that I would put on. And one thing led to another. When he got offered, well, the long story, it seems like we're telling the longer stories, is that so those guys were in a band called The Section, which was also Craig Durgee on keyboards and Leland, Russ, and Danny. And it was an instrumental kind of rock fusion band. And they were the backup band to James Taylor and Jackson Browne. And I guess James Taylor just one day said, and behind me is The Section. And he just named them. And anyway, they ended up getting signed as their own band, and they made 3 records, I believe. Fusiony, very cool records. So flash forward to 8 years ago or so, 10 years ago, and this Japanese label got the rights to re-release the Section records. And they called Danny and they said, look, we're going to re-release these records. You guys, we'd love you to come on tour. And Danny talked to the guys, and I guess ultimately, at this point, it just wasn't where any of them were at in their heads. Was that music to relearn it all and play? It just wasn't where they were at in their lives. So Danny said, "Yeah, I'm gonna turn down we're not gonna do it." And I said, "Well, why don't they want you? Why don't we put together something fun and go to Japan?" He said, "Well, I don't know. What do you?" Oh, well, I said, like the thing when we do the jams, but let's call it Danny Kortchmar and Friends. See if they'll go for it. And they went great. So we went over with from Jackson Browne's band. We had Bob Glaub on bass and Jeff Young, who passed, the late Jeff Young, the incredible singer, keyboard player, and Steve Holley from Wings. And we went over and while we were there, Danny solidified this record deal with a label that wanted him to recreate his version with him singing of many of the hits he'd written, which are Somebody's Baby, New York Minute, Dirty Laundry, etc., etc. So we came back to the studio I'm sitting in now, and we started put together the pre-production for this record. And Danny called his best friends, which was Waddy, Postell, Leland Sklar, Russ Kunkel. And I mean, to this day, he's kind of amazed that they were all free on the same weekend, which was,
Really?
as we're finding, trying to do shows, almost an impossibility. And we went into Jackson Browne, lent us his beautiful studio, and we went in and started cutting this record, which was Danny Korchmar. And there was an instant rapport and chemistry to the point where Danny not only said, "Wow, we're the immediate family," but then he changed the name of the record to Danny Korchmar and the Immediate Family. And the next thing you know, we were a band.
Okay, so that young kid that you talked about before and witnessing this band on stage and thinking, I want to be them. And there you are in the studio with them, playing with them. What do you learn from that experience? When you look at these people you admired for so many years, and there you are playing with them.
Well, one is I got to keep up. You know, I really got to keep up. But I had experience with that. I had a studio for many years with Steve Ferrone from Tom Petty the Heartbreakers and Eric Clapton's band, and Steve's one of the best drummers in the world. So just being with him every day for 4 years, I had the same feeling. Like I got to play in time, man. Steve's gonna. I don't want to get that dirty look. Um, so I was familiar with having someone great in the studio to sort of up my game. It's the old sports thing. If you want to get good at basketball when you're 13, you got to play with the 15-year-olds. That's the only way. You got to play with the people who are better than you and more experienced than you.
Right.
So, one hand, it was exciting, and I had to up my game. Like really show up with put my best foot forward. Um, it was thrilling for sure to look around that Jackson studio and see those guys and be playing that music. And it's also what I do. So there's the part of it's like I'm doing what I do now. I'm doing this thing. I think that the and the guys were all already my friends. They weren't the only one I didn't really know well. I did one session with was Waddy, and I think Waddy was like, "No, so who's this guy? What like?" And then, but very soon, he said, "Oh, I see what he's doing. Yeah, it's cool." But he doesn't suffer fools, so I kind of had to prove to Waddy that there was a reason I was in the room.
Well, it's a fascinating journey you've taken from that young kid who saw the guitar player in Central Park to where you are today. It's been a real pleasure meeting you. And I just want to finish off with one final question. At this point, do you have any other goals?
Well, when you get to be my age, staying alive is a really good goal. Uh,
But musically, are there goals that you still.
yes, there is. I would like right now, which is what I'm doing, to to make my music as much of a priority as some of the other projects have always been. So that every year, in addition to producing some records, in addition to going out with our house, in addition to playing with the Immediate Family, that Steve Postell is out there, not in a show every month, but on a tour. That's I've had bands. My Little Blue used to tour, but I that's sort of the final frontier is is that particularly off of this record that hey, I'm going to you know Italy for 3 weeks to play my music with this band that I put together. So that's um, still sort of the final frontier for me in terms of all these different things I've done, and that's kind of what we're working on right now, which is great.
Well, it's a beautiful album, and I thank you so much for spending this time with me.
It's been a lot of fun, a lot of good questions. You made me rack my memory.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Great, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.